Welcome back, Fantasy Fiction Fanatics. It's great to see you again, and I hope you're doing well. Today we are doing a character analysis, and today's analysis is going to be on Tanis Half Elven. And luckily for me, I have a guest with me today. I've got Adam from DragonLance Saga. Welcome,
Hey.
Adam. Thanks so much for coming today.
I really appreciate the invite. I'd love talking Dragonlance in general, and Tanis Half Elven is one of my favorite characters, so this is going to be a great conversation, I think.
Yeah, I'm really excited, and thanks for being the first guest on Fantasy Fiction Fanatics. I really hope that you enjoy it, and thanks again for inviting me last time onto your channel.
No problem at all. It's my honor to be here, honestly.
I'll make sure that there is a link for your channel and probably a card around here that someone can click on if you want to go ahead and check out Adam's channel. It's really great. If you love Dragonlance, definitely head over right there. All right, let's go ahead and get started with our analysis. Do you want to go ahead and introduce our character today with our profile?
Sure. Tanis Half Elven is one of those pivotal characters in the entire saga. He's the reluctant leader of the companions who's sort of torn between the worlds of men and elves and accepted by neither of those worlds. He's always willing to put himself out on a limb because the fact is no one else, the other companions are really willing to take up the role of leadership, and he doesn't really even see himself as a leader, which I think is very interesting. But everything he does, it's because of this overarching sense of morality he has, even though he's torn between, ultimately throughout the course of the saga, two different women who are the polar opposites of each other in that scope of good and evil and neutrality.
That's a really good profile about him. That's really great. I think Tanis is always like as you said, the leader. So I really think that when you think of Dragonlance, at least the original Chronicles, Tanis is one of the main people that come to your mind.
Yeah.
So I think he's a really important one to dive into and to really look at what he brings to the story. So.
Yeah.
All right, Adam. So what did you think of for his main defining traits?
Ultimately, I think above and beyond anything else, it's care for his family. You know, not the nuclear family he was born into, because he never knew who that was. He was adopted. But ultimately, Flint Fireforge is his immediate father figure after he left Colonisty. And so his care for those around him, whether it's the Majir twins or Sturm, his sense of leadership, I think, is the biggest trait on his. And again, just to sort of reiterate, the reluctant leader. He doesn't want to be doing this, but no one else is. And so he figures, well, if not anyone else, then I'd better just step up and do it.
That's definitely true. So I have quite a few traits that I think are pretty defining, but I will admit that I was kind of struggling with figuring out his actual, what I think are his defining traits. I do think he's very charismatic, which I think leads to him being the kind of the leader, because he's just really good at dealing with people and people really like going to him. I think he's very caring and very smart, which also, again, adds to the reason why he is the leader. Those are both traits of a good leader. Yeah. And I think that he has one of the higher traits is that being conflicted. I think that's something that's very defining for him, is he's kind of back and forth a lot, especially like you said in the profile, we've got the defining factors between his elven self and his human self.
Yeah.
But I can't really know. I put loyalty on my list as well, but I have a hard time truly committing to that trait.
Right.
Because I feel like there's also many times when he's not really that loyal, especially in the field of romance. And so he's back and forth between the two girls, and then even to his friends, he lies to his friends because he doesn't want them to know he was with Kitiara and stuff. So I feel like he's loyal, but then at the same time, there's a lot of things that kind of detract from that loyalty.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the reasons why I really, really like his character is because even when he has those moments of weakness, when he's in Tarsus and he gets seduced by Kitiara, for example, and he straight up lies to his friends about where he's been, there is a time at the other end of the entire experience where, he feels guilty about it. He's not like a sociopath or anything. He genuinely has emotions and he's conflicted. And so when he does finally admit the truth, as he always eventually does, is relatable because we all make mistakes in life, and we all have to sort of face the truth of our own choices, and in some cases the consequences of those choices. And I like that we see that echoed in his imperfect character. You know, you look at some of the other characters like Kitiara, who is just abject, self-interested, and usually evil in her choices, and she is unforgiving. And so it's harder to relate to a character like that. Or Raistlin Majir is another one that's, you know, he's always just self-interested in power, seizing power and growth of his own power. And so with Tanis, you actually get to see that balance of, yes, I do bad things. I am repentant to my friends over it when it's something that I've done wrong that affects them, or I just internalize that anguish when it's something that I've done wrong that is going to represent, you know, is going to make myself suffer in those cases.
True. Yep. So I ended up adding it because, like you said, it is relatable, and it's like he is, for the most part, loyal to, especially his friends. At least he is never going to leave them. And even though he was lying about Kitiara, he did come back to them, and he's like, no, like my real place is to be with my friends and to finish this journey. So
yeah.
Well, awesome. Anything else you can think of, or
as far as traits? No, I think that's good.
Cool. All right. So I guess our next big discussion for Tanis would be the fact that he is half elven and how that affects him, because I think that's obviously a big part of who he is.
Yeah. This poor guy. Like, you know, as creating a character for Dungeons and Dragons, which this entire story is based off of, you choose, you know, whether you're going to be a half elven or an elf or a human or something. But as the character is concerned, he had no say, of course. And he just happened to be the son of an elven woman. And so it was Solstaren, the speaker of the Sons, I think it was. I'm going to have to double check that. That adopts him, basically. And I mean, on one side, he is literally royal blood. Like, it was Solistaren's sister, I think it was, that was his mother. And so the idea that Solistaren's daughter and him are connecting is a little wonky. It's a little iffy.
A little bit, yeah.
But, you know, the fact that the Quillency, who are supposed to be the more accepting of the two primary elven nations, are still just treating him terribly because he's not a full elf. He's only half a man. He's not even a full man, you know. So it's just his very nature means he's less than compared to literally any other species on Krynn. And that just affects his psyche from the very beginning, constantly being reminded of it. And Flint recognizes this trait within him that he always goes back to Quillency because he wants to feel like, you know, maybe get past that blood race issue, but the family, the society of Quillency will never get past it. And so he's constantly going back to this well of pain and suffering to be reminded that he will never be good enough in their eyes. And even when he leaves that, he's stuck in the human side of the world, where he's just exact same treated, you know, he's not even a full man. He's one of those elven people, and, you know, they're less than us burly humans. So he just can't get a break no matter what he does.
I know. And it's always, I think any person wants to be accepted by the people that raise them and like with their family. So it definitely makes sense that he would want to be at least accepted. And then since he can't be accepted there, I mean, he wants to be accepted somewhere, but it's just not easy in the world that he's living in for this to happen. And it's not like there's other, like a majority of other like half elven people out there that he can connect with. It's not like there's a subculture or anything. So it is unfortunate for him.
Do you think that
go ahead.
Do you think that that's why he is so connected with his friends, his sort of formed family, because no one else in the world accepts him? And so the only place he can find any sense of reciprocal friend love is through those family members he's been able to choose. Do you think that is why? Or is it just an inherent trait of him that he's always going to be genuine and honest and caring about those around him?
No, I think that you're right. I think that is one of the biggest reasons that he is so loyal to them and cares about them so much, is because they're the people who accepted him when he's had nobody accept him. Though, I mean, you could also put it in other terms like, oh, but Laurana always accepted him and he ran away from her.
Yeah.
But I think because these are people who have had no connection whatsoever to his, elven side, and no real connection to like specifically humans. I mean, obviously there are a couple humans, but it's not like anything that's specific that's like happened with them. It's that he's found them and they just accept him, no questions asked.
Yeah.
Even with like Strum, he's a knight, and they're kind of known for being pretty prejudiced, especially against elves. And he follows the code very strictly, but yet he really respects Tanis, and doesn't let the half elven part get in his way. And I think that means a lot to Tanis.
Yeah, I totally agree with that.
It's definitely, I think, a big part of, or a big root cause about why Tanis is so conflicted. In nature is because he is being pulled between two sides that don't accept him, and so he's trying to find some kind of vacillating back and forth to try and see, like, can I be accepted in one way or the other, and he doesn't really know which way to go to feel like he is where he wants to be as a person, and feel emotionally like he fits in somewhere.
Yeah, it's got to be. Yeah, I have 2 kids, and so the idea of providing a safe and welcoming and loving, supportive environment for them is just kind of like, yeah, of course, that's what else would I do?
Right.
But to try to imagine that world where you are constantly being, if not overtly picked on and psychologically abused by the entire society, let alone your own family. And seemingly the only person that ever shows any sort of affection to you is your cousin, Laurana, and you're just kids, you're just children ostensibly, and she and both of them together have this sort of crush with each other, and they trade rings, which becomes an issue later on in the actual Chronicles trilogy. But that connection led directly to him leaving. Because as soon as Gilthanas found out about it, that these cousins were actually thinking about being married to each other when they grow up, whatever that means, because
Right.
hundreds of years old as an elf. Like, you finally found love in a society that hates you, and that is what causes you to be forced to leave. Otherwise, you're gonna have to fight her brother, like who was you before that second was your best friend. Like, God, that's got to be just the worst.
Well, it's also horrible in the fact that then you find out, well, Gilthanas must not really love him that much as it seemed like it, because the second he finds out like that he is romantically interested in his sister, he's like, oh, well, then we're done.
Yeah.
So it was very, I don't want to say it was disingenuous, but it was obviously not very strong in Gilthanas' favor, because it was able to crack so easily.
Yeah.
So I definitely think that being half elven is one of his main defining factors, especially with the fact that once we're, in the Chronicles, he grows out that beard in order to try and be more human and seem more human. So we definitely see that he's in the midst of being like on the total opposite spectrum of trying to be as human as possible. And so you really see that shift that he's taken, especially when you go back to Qualinisti and you realize where he started off as.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because all of his friends are like, what's with the beard? Like at the beginning of Chronicles, because, you got to realize, like, they only knew him as the shaved half-elven boy, not the rugged adventuring man that they are reintroduced to him after those 5 years of wandering. I mean, that's I think that's really funny. In order to survive in this world, you have to hide who you truly are. And that's devastating as an individual.
Devastating. You're right. I can't imagine being that hated in both societies. Especially when, for at least the elves, even if they are prejudiced, like, I mean, they grew up with him. You would think that they would care about him and after spending years and years with him. But even that doesn't cure it for them. And I think it also doesn't help is the nature of the way that his mom had him, and the fact that it was a forced interaction, not a genuine interaction, which I think does make it worse. And I think it makes it worse as a kid that had to know that was what happened to your mom, and that you're the product of that, and a reminder of that as well. Yeah,
it's interesting because there's 2 different origin stories. There's that version that you were alluding to. And then there's another version where it's a perspective shift on the same story, where she actually was, it was almost like a Stockholm syndrome. She was taken to be ransomed, and then they fell in love, and then they had Tanis. And then he was, I can't remember if he abandoned her or if he was killed. But in either case, it was born out of a very difficult situation that is not a 100% willing situation on both sides. So yeah,
that's interesting. I didn't know about the second possible origin. I'm not sure. Do you remember where that comes up in the story?
There's the preludes, and then there's the meeting sextet, and I think between those two are two different versions of his origin.
Gotcha.
And that's where the discord. I mean, this is something that is famous with DragonLance. Is a new author comes in, and they sort of change the story to fit their own narrative of how they want to move forward with the story. And if it wasn't Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman writing it, then it was someone else's perspective on how they wanted the character to be.
Right.
And it didn't always coincide, and Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman weren't always there to ask questions when these new novels were coming out. So it did become a little contentious, especially with a fan base. Like if you're so used to Tanis's mother not being royalty and not being the cousin to Lorana, because that's one of the origin versions of it, then it's weird hearing that he was going to marry his cousin. But I mean, there's just so many different ways. We get so invested in these fictional characters and how we understand them and how we want them to be, that when someone else presents an alternative view, it's almost like we can't cope with it in some cases. Like, no, that can never be.
I will admit that is one of the reasons why I haven't explored as much of Dragonlance as I would like to, is because I feel like if it's not the original authors, then I'm like, it's so hard for me to be like, accepting somebody else's vision, I guess. It's like, I love Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman so much that it's like, did anyone else really portray it right? But then I also do miss out on a lot of good stories. So I'm hoping to eventually find time to branch out.
Yeah.
But, okay, cool. Is there anything else that you think we should discuss for being half elven for Tanis?
So. I think we're good.
I think the only thing that I had left just to kind of touch on just a little bit was just, I do think that being half elven is a big reason for a lot of the paths that he chooses in his life. I do think that is always in his mind, and that really influences a lot of his decisions. Whether, obviously, it's not his decision to leave Qualinisti, but it was his decision to then, make all these friends, go on these adventures, and then what he chooses between the romances, and I think a lot of that does influence how he chooses to go about things.
Yeah, definitely.
Cool. All right. So the next thing to talk about will be the role in the story. It looks like based on my notes that I should maybe start this one, since I kind of started the role going for that. All right. Yeah. So I had two different roles that I saw really clearly as for Tanis, and the first one is the leader, which is pretty obvious in the fact that he is the leader of the group, and he does have those strong leadership qualities, especially for his friends. Yeah. They always look to him to be the final decision maker. Even I've noticed, like, even in like personal times or whatever, like when it's just more of a personal problem, they always go to him and they ask for his advice and they ask for his lead on like, oh, how would you handle this situation? So in that case, he's kind of the leader in all senses. And I also think he is, in the same sense, the judge or the mediator, in the fact that everything that there's problems, personal, group-wise, whatever, he's the one that is the final say in everything. And he's the one that they go to make the judgment calls.
Yeah, absolutely. I like how Margaret Weiss, I sort of put this in the wrong section, but Margaret Weiss gave a little synopsis of why Tanis is the way he is thematically. And she says he's introspective. He thinks a lot about himself and other people in his life, and that allows us to see the other characters through his eyes. And I thought that was interesting because traditionally, you don't really ever, at least I can't think of any characters in any other stories I've read that are meant to be almost a lens to see through. to see the other characters through that lens. And it's an interesting way because usually, you're either getting it directly from the mind of the character, so innately, like, this is who this character is and who they think they are, or you're getting it just from how the author is portraying their actions. But to then see other characters through one character and their own inability to, constantly being torn between two different worlds ostensibly, I think that's an interesting way, or it's an interesting reason to have a character. When you think about the entire thematic elements of Dragonlance, it's always good over evil and trying to maintain a balance. And not that balance means not just good and not just evil. And those three characters, when Laura and Tracy Hickman were traveling from Utah to Lake Geneva in order to first be hired on with TSR, the people who hired them to do the books and modules for Dragonlance, they came up with those three characters of Laurana, Tanis, and Kitiara specifically because they represented each of those alignments of good, neutrality, and evil, and how neutrality is always being torn on one side or the other by good or evil, depending on the strength of either. And so we see that thematically through Tanis's relationship as the neutral character being torn between Laurana, the good character, and Kitiara, the evil character.
That's really interesting that you brought that up because I never thought about it in those terms at all. I mean, I always thought about it as like, obviously Kitiara is, the evil person, not a good person. And I have Laurana, who's like such a sweet, caring person that you all love and you want him to end up with. But I never really thought about Tanis being the neutral one being torn between the two. I just always looked at the perspective of like, oh, his human and his elvish side. Right. So I think that that's super interesting that was actually the intention, was more of a good versus evil type balance versus a elf versus human balance.
Yeah.
Do you think,
oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, do you think then that Tanis is truly neutral? Do you see him as a neutral party?
And
what does it mean then that he chose a side?
Yeah.
I mean, technically at the end he does choose one.
Yeah, well, I think he has to be neutral. Thematically, he's definitely neutral. As far as his actions throughout the course of it, we see him swing both ways, right? I mean, he goes, and ultimately, everything he's doing is with the intention of good. And when you think of what the world of Krynn is, the situation that it's in right now, you have this huge presence of the Queen of Darkness and all of her armies sweeping across the continent of Ansalon. Evil is then outweighed, and so the neutrality has to shift to good to maintain that balance. And so if we're thinking about it in those terms, then Tanis is, yes, neutral, but he's swinging to good in order to help just bring the balance back to Krynn. And we do see him, again, seduced in Tarsus by Kitiara, and he pretty much abandons his friends, I think, for a couple nights. But it's just, he swings back eventually, which is good.
Yeah, that's true. So I really like that you brought that up. That's a really interesting point. I would never have thought of that myself.
I wouldn't either. It was the authors. I just took it from them.
Thank you, Tracy, for pointing that out for us.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, awesome. Anything else?
I can't really. No, I don't think so. I think that's pretty much his role in the story. I mean, 100%.
Cool. All right. So the next thing that I always feel like seems very similar and yet are different is that we have the role in the story, but then we've got what he actually brings to the story, which I do think, talking about your quote and talking about the neutral and the good versus evil does apply to this as well.
Yeah.
But what do you think you actually get from Tanis as a character that you don't get from any other character?
I think it's him being inconsistent more than anything else. Like he will always be inconsistent in everything. Like he's the leader, but he doesn't want to be the leader. He loves Laurana, but he thinks she's childish, and so he can't be with her. He loves Kitiara, but she's evil, and he can't go along and be evil himself. He hates the gods dabbling in the world's affairs, but then he works basically for the gods in order to restore that balance. He hates being, he distrusts Raistlin, and this is a big one too, because Raistlin's such a huge presence in the entire Chronicles. He distrusts him, and yet he goes to him for advice all the time. So it's like he's constantly inconsistent in everything he does.
Which is so funny that you say that, because to me, my top thing that he brings me is stability, which
Yeah,
totally counteracts what you're saying.
but I don't know.
But
It kind of works.
because what you're saying is so true, and I didn't think about it that way, but that's so true. But for me, the stability part of it was because Tanis is always there. Like, you can always count on Tanis being there. And not only that, but I feel like out of the whole narration, we get to see from Tanis's perspective, I guess you could say, the most. Like, when you're reading it and we're jumping around different characters, if you're in the group that Tanis is in, most of the time it's going to be focused on how Tanis is seeing everybody. And so to me, I'm like, oh, like, I really get the stability from him, is because he always count that he's going to be there and he's going to be with his friends, making sure that they're protected or okay, leading them. Even when they get separated, he's still trying his best to work his way back to getting everybody to be one solid group again. So I felt like you're right. It's inconsistency, but he is stable in his inconsistency, I guess.
Yeah. Well, and he is the one that's constantly pushing forward the storyline, I mean,
Right.
to your point of the stability, everyone else wants to do different things. Raceland's constantly trying to go collect artifacts of power, or, Fisidanalis' spellbook or something. Cameron just wants to chase after him. Tasselhoff is constantly, trying to do other things. And Tanis is always the one's like, this is what we have to do. Come on. He's like rounding up the chickens. Like, this is the direction.
I think it's interesting too, because when the two splits off, the two ends up being two groups instead of one, is we've got Tanis being like the leader and like the stability for one group, and then you also have Laurana that ends up being the stability for the other one, and they're both in many senses trying to get back to each other.
Yeah.
So I just think, I mean, I know that doesn't really totally relate to Tanis's character, but I think that that's super interesting, that one of the people he's actually interested in is the other person that ends up taking over his role for that other group.
Yeah. I don't think I've ever, I'm like, that's like an obvious thing that happens. I don't think I've ever really thought of it in those terms before, that the two that were raised together end up being the leaders of the two different groups.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I also would just want to give a quick note that I was saying that it was in Tarsus. It was not in Tarsus that he and Kitiara hooked up. That was, I actually can't remember the name of the port right now, but it's on the other side of the continent. Tarsus is where they initially, yeah.
But yes, you're right. That was
split originally. Yeah, that's interesting. Because Laurana's definitely in a similar mode. She doesn't want to be the leader either. She's trying to prove herself to Tanis that she can be, the woman that he would eventually want still. Wow, interesting.
Yeah, it is super interesting. I mean, I don't know. I think a lot of it may be that maybe he influenced her, and the fact that she saw what he was doing, and that ended up just being how she ended up taking over it. But I just think it is an interesting point that he kind of ends up, when they branch off, that they end up both being there, and they're both, especially Laurana, but they're both kind of in a way trying to merge back together, so that way the group is, I mean, obviously Laurana's always like, oh, how do I get back to Tanis?
Yeah.
But I think Tanis in a way is also trying to get back to her. I mean, before they end up splitting off, he ends up leaving the other half in the inn or whatever, and he's in his mind at that point had decided, okay, I'm pro Laurana right now.
Yeah.
So until Kitiara comes in, I think he is still in the mind of like trying to get back to her.
Yeah, I think so too.
Okay. Anything else for his role? I did put that what he brings is kind of harsh truths. That's kind of something I think I see a lot with his character. The reality of how people treat each other, the reality of the prejudice in this world, the reality that sometimes you have to pick and choose sides, just everything that you don't really want to have to deal with. I feel like Tanis ends up having to deal with, or ends up having to confront in order to move forward. So I felt like he brought out a lot of that for me personally.
Yeah, I can see that too. I mean, he did the same thing also with how the companions reacted to Riverwind and Goldmoon. If memory serves, and it has been a little while since I've read the book, like a year, I think he was one of the ones that was like getting in there like, all right, guys, let's hear her out. Let's, hear what she has to say. And then as unbelievable of a story as you could ever imagine her delivering. You know, this staff turns blue and heals and harms, and it literally teleported us through the Abanasinia. Like, how could you ever believe that? And yet he's there. He's like, you know what? Let's hear her out. And let's, you know, if this is truly proof of the gods, then we need to follow it to its course and figure something out. It seems like he was a mediator in all of the prejudice, probably because he suffered on the, you know, and bad end of the stick of prejudice his whole life.
Well, and the thing about that too is that Riverwind was very prejudiced against him. It took him a long time to finally wear him down, and for Riverwind to be like, "Oh, I really respect you and think well of you." So he even took them in, despite the fact that at least Riverwind was very prejudiced toward him from the beginning.
Yeah.
He had to fight through that.
Yeah, that's weird about Riverwind too. He was like always negative to everyone. And I understand, like, as a character, part of it is you're trying to protect your basically your priestess and your lover, but the other side of that is, why are you so rude to everyone? Like, give him the benefit. Like, he had a bad time with his clan,
yeah.
Which seems like all the more reason to have a Tanis-like reaction rather than, I don't know, the way he did.
I know, it is interesting. I mean, I can't imagine him being another way because, I mean, I'm just so used to him being that way. But I do think in general, the barbarians were not the most inclusive people, just in general. And obviously, you know, sometimes hatred gets passed down to the next generation just from living in that kind of environment.
Sure.
But I do think it shows a lot that Tanis does overcome prejudice a lot, and the fact that like I mentioned earlier with Strum and his knighthood, like I don't remember exactly, but I felt like I remembered him having to win Strum over a little bit too at first, for them to kind of be where he was a little bit standoffish against him being elvish, and then Riverwind eventually is very close to Tanis despite everything, because he just realized how good of a guy he is. So I would say I don't really totally understand, like you said, like Riverwind, other than maybe it's cultural. But Tanis is obviously an amazing person to have brooded that away to and letting him see who he truly is instead of judging him based on his heritage.
Yeah, for sure. I guess there also has to be a little element of acknowledgement that they don't really have a lot of time to think either. I mean,
well, that's true. I mean, they basically, this is another thing that I think is very defining of Tanis, is that they get into this trouble. It's happening right away. And instead of him just being like, oh, you brought this upon us, like, get out. He's like, no, guys, we're keeping them. We're going to protect them and help them get where they need to go.
We're keeping them.
They are staying in our group, okay?
Yeah. We've adopted you into the tribe. Come with us. Let's go out through the kitchen. Yeah.
But obviously, Fizbin knew what he was doing when he put them on the path.
Yeah. He's like pushed them on the path.
Oh, yeah. He was like, oh, task him over here. We know you like waving staffs around.
Yeah. Fizban is awesome. And I love how Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman use that character throughout all their other trilogies as well. And they just change the words, the letters around. Like Zifnab.
Fizban's one of my favorite characters of all time. Him and Tass are both, especially when they're together, it's the perfect combination. Okay, cool. Anything else on what you think brings Tanis, or what Tanis brings to the story?
I think we covered it.
Cool. All right, next we're on to his goals. So goals are very important for a character. It makes it so you can have motivations and to move forward in the story. What do you think his top goals were?
So I think initially, because we're introduced under the context of them returning after this 5-year wandering in order to find some sort of evidence of the gods on Krynn, because we open in the absence of any gods. And so initially, I think we're presented with this idea of, well, he's searching for gods. That's his initial motivation. But I think more than that, because they didn't find any, spoiler at the very beginning of the book. Right. More than that, he's trying to find connections in this world. We already mentioned he was ostracized from his homeland, He is outcast no matter what society he happens to find himself in. He has to hide who he is just to get along. And so when he did build that relationship with Kitiara early in their childhood, that became really, really important for him. And so he just falls head over heels in love with the one person who accepted him without any hesitation and always had his back. And so he's always longing for her and fantasizing about seeing her again after those 5 years. And when he does show up and she doesn't, he's a little devastated. And so this inner drive of his is to get back to the one person that always accepted him and loved him, you know? So I think trying to connect with loved ones, trying to find the gods, you know, these are the major overarching goals of his.
Interesting. I find it really interesting that you saw the god connection, because for me, I never really took the search for the gods as more as Goldmoon's goal, and he was just there because they were all helping facilitate Goldmoon. I think that's super interesting. I didn't really see him as a religious person in that way, so I think that that's a really interesting perspective, that he was taking on that goal because he was helping Gold.
Yeah, and to be honest, it was a sort of a Preludes and Meeting Sextet goal when they initially all broke apart to go find evidence of the gods, because it was the seeker movement that was really popular, and they were clearly charlatans, and so they were just trying to find some sort of evidence. And this is way before Goldmoon is ever even introduced to them. But as soon as, and I don't even think he's particularly religious at all. I think that was just something that they all thought, you know, we all need to go on in our own little journeys. Let's come back and see what we found after that, you know, after 5 years. But as far as soon as Goldmoon gets into the picture, I think his biggest motivation and goal has got to be to not only find out why are there goblins and hobgoblins that took over Solus. Like, that is not normal, you know, like everyone that they originally come back and they're immediately attacked by goblins on the way to Solus. And once they get to Solus, everyone's acting all strange, like they don't know who they are, but they were raised here. Like, this is their home for years before they left. And they were only gone 5 years, so they should have friends there. And seemingly only the proprietor Odic and the barmaid Tika know him. And you're just like, where are all your buddies? Like, what happened to everyone? Like, this whole new movement came in. And so as soon as that happens, then he's like, well, we got to get to the bottom of what's going on, because this is not the place I remember, you know?
Right. And this is why it helps that you're here to discuss him, because I haven't read those books. So it's really an interesting perspective, because I never really saw Tanis as that kind of person. So I think that it's really, really interesting and adds depth for me as well, for him as a character. For his goals, for me personally, I was just saying that his main goal throughout, I think, the whole trilogy is to protect his friends. Like, I mean, I think that's always his constant is, how do I get us through the crap that we're somehow finding ourselves in, and how do we get out the other side all intact? So I think that's one of his main goals. And also just to find, I think through this journey, he's trying to find his place in the world as well still. I think that's always kind of an underarching goal for him. But just even like, I feel like in a way he feels like choosing a side for romantically does kind of distinguish, like, okay, this is where I'm saying my place in the world is, with the elves or with the humans. And so in a way he's searching through the romance as well, like, where is my place?
Yeah, I would agree with that. Definitely. All
right. Cool. Simple enough. Now we get on to the not so simple discussion of relationships.
Ooh, yeah. Convoluted.
So I remember when I was doing the reading of this and doing the videos of the breakdowns, is when it came to Laurana and Kitiara, I mentioned that, well, and I also mentioned this about Caramon, but Laurana and Kitiara and Tanis all have kind of a toxic relationship. I felt they were very, especially with the Laurana Tanis side of it, was very toxic. So I am very interested to talk about his romantic interests with you. Did you want to start with a particular one in general, or just three of them, or?
Well, I mean, let's start with his relationship with Lorana, since I was the first one that he connects with and the one he ends up with, in the very, very end. I thought that was so interesting because he saw it as a childhood fling, but she had just like clutched onto that and just rode it all until they met again years and years later. And he's like, look, you're just a kid. You're a spoiled little brat. Like, leave me alone. And she's just like, but you loved me. It's just like heartbreaking, It's like it's just not reciprocal, honey. I'm sorry. You need to move on. It's a good thing she didn't, but.
Right. And I will say, now, I love Lorana to death, but I will say she does start off in a very innocent, very naive place. So I can't totally blame him in the fact that he's gone through a lot since he left Qualanisty. He is not the same person as when he was there. For him to see her as more of an immature woman, just because she is so sheltered. So it wasn't really her fault and nothing against her, but I can understand why his feelings would have changed based on his experiences.
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
And Lorana changes once she goes out into the real world too. So that's a big reason why they're able to then reconnect.
I think what's so interesting about her is that she was not only just sheltered because she's an elf in Qualanisty, which is generally sheltered from the rest of the world anyway, but she was royalty. She didn't even go out amongst the other common elves. She was basically, you could just imagine her just being locked in this palace and just being doted over by servants. And literally, like in some cases, they're seen as slaves. You're born into your role in society, and so you're born into slavery to serve the monarchy. And that is her worldview. And so when this boy who may or may not be her cousin, and they're children, and they express love and share this ring, and finally he comes back, it's totally rational for her to think, oh, well, he's coming back for me, because that's the naive world she lives in. Everything's for her, It's just, and from the outside, of course, we're just like, you spoiled little brat. Like, how could you ever? You need to grow up. But that's all she knows. And as soon as she is exposed to other perspectives, arguably it's her at the very end that has more perspective and is more accepting than anyone else. And I think that's great as far as her character arc. But I don't want to get on a tangent about talking about another character, but yeah.
But yeah, I definitely agree with all of what you're saying, and I do agree with the fact that that's why he comes off to like a very cold start to her until she kind of experiences some things and grows up a little bit. But I think that also she, based on when she's growing up and she's kind of interacting with him more, it does help him grow as a character, and the fact that he sees her growth and he sees how much she changes and still holds on to that love for him. I mean, I know he was gone for a long time. I don't remember the exact years, but wasn't it like 50 years or something like that since he'd been back to Qualanisty? And she had still loved him through all that time by herself. She loved him through all the crap that he put her through, being hot, cold, good person, bad person, not really sure where he stood. And yet at the end, she still cares about him and still is willing to stand by him. And I think that really affects him as a person, is that just undying loyalty.
Yeah, I think it's so hard in life to swallow your own sense of individuality and connect and grow with another human being in general. I like seeing that it wasn't just cut and dry, a simple thing for them. They had to grow together. He had to see her grow as a young elven woman, and she had to see him as he interacts with the greater world and the choices that he makes and the type of a human and elf that he actually is versus her imagination of what he was. And I think, it's so difficult to grow together and accept someone else and their decisions when you're a kid, and when you can finally make that connection as an adult and have that shared growth. I mean, that's what life's all about, in my opinion. I've been married for over 20 years at this point, so it's one of those magical things as human beings that we actually finally get to connect with another human being on a level that you will never connect with anyone else. A depth of understanding and at times frustration and anger, but that's natural and normal. And it's working through that. And we see that same dynamic between those two of Tanis and Laurana. And that's why I think it's so relatable and believable.
I agree. And I think that that's why in the end he chooses her, is because he had more growth with her than he had with Kitiara, who
Absolutely.
he in many ways went backwards with.
Yeah, for sure.
So what do you think about his relationship with Kitiara? How do you think that has defined him?
Well, he was, outside of Flint, his sort of father figure, she was his first real romantic relationship, I think. I mean, I think some of the past novels and stuff, he did have flings with other people, but this was the first one where they were on equal terms. Like, they were equally good fighters. She didn't back down. She didn't take the role of what could be seen as a traditional sort of effeminate woman who lets the man do whatever he wants and just sort of follows him around. No, she stepped up and she took charge, and in some cases told him what to do. And so she was a different type of a person than he'd ever met before. And they had this incredibly chaotic, non-healthy relationship, just this abusive connection that, may be fun from time to time, but you can't grow there. You can't stay in that chaos.
I always felt like his connection to Kitiara was more about lust than love,
Yeah.
and he just was mistaking it for love.
Yeah, I think that's ultimately what he comes to understand.
Just the ultimate wanting of somebody, and maybe in a case just because he didn't have somebody. I mean, maybe that was the person that just was convenient in the fact that not saying that she didn't accept him, obviously she did, but it was the convenient of, this person has accepted me, and this is the first person who really I connect with that has accepted me, who is also eligible to be romantic with.
Yeah.
So I think that a lot of that ties together into just the pull that he had toward her was more of a feeling of a need than a deep love.
Yeah, I mean, for her, I think there's an element of exoticism to it. He's not quite human. He's a little different. I mean, he's arguably, he's an attractive individual. He's fit. She's, lives that adventurous lifestyle, and everything about her is dominance. I need that person to want me, and then I might give them a taste and I might not, but as long as they keep wanting me. And what drives her crazy more than anything else is the idea that, what if Tanis doesn't want me anymore? What if he's chasing that stupid elven girl? Like, I need him to want me, I need him to hurt for me. Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, I think that is such an abusive relationship. If you ever find anyone watching this, you find yourself in a relationship like that, do yourself a favor and get out, because it's not good for you.
Yeah, definitely. Especially because she also pulls out a lot of the darker sides of him. Like, obviously, we didn't see it as much with the whole interactions before the 5-year period that they went off away with. Like, we didn't have that pretext, at least I don't, from the chronicles.
Yep.
But we do know that once he is back in her life a little bit, she's on the wrong side of the thing, and he is kind of dancing around, like staying with her and being on the evil side because that's what it takes to be with her, versus immediately saying, no, you're not what I want, and walking away from her. He does kind of teeter on that side, like, oh, well, could I deal with being that kind of person to have what I want?
Yeah, that's a rough position to find yourself in. Because ultimately it's him saying, am I the man I want to be, or am I the man that she wants me to be? And that's got to be tough when you're just getting endorphins flooding your brain because of the connection and the lust that's being satiated. I mean, how do you get clarity? And the only way he ever even got it was in her absence. Then he could finally think straight, and he wrote that letter, and he got out. But
well, yeah, I mean, he originally goes in, and when he meets up with her, he's like, okay, I know what I'm doing. I'm just gonna get in, get out, and then he's like, oh, I've been here for 3 days. How did that happen?
I mean, it's like a drug abuser, It's like, oh, I'm just gonna get one more hit, and then you just lose yourself.
So obviously she's not the greatest influence for him.
For sure.
I don't know if it was always really where she was evil beforehand. I think that was a little bit more of a newer addition where she just was like, I'm more power hungry now, but it's still obviously, it was not obviously a good relationship beforehand, as we've discussed. So.
Yeah.
All right. So What other relationships do you think really affected Tanis?
I like Flint's. I mean, he's the only positive role model in Tanis's life that always was there for him, which makes it even more devastating when what happens. But and like when that did happen, and Tanis lashes out at Barham, I totally believed it. Like that's my dad. That's the only person that's ever cared for me, and it looks like you just killed him. I'm going to murder you.
Yeah.
I mean, the rage and the pain and the sorrow, and every time I read it, I get swept up in all of those emotions. He was so nurturing to Tanis. He just took him under his wing because he was a lost bird, with a broken wing. And so he's like, come, let me help you. And you can even live with me, and you help me with my business, and we'll travel around. And it's just like, I don't know, it's so important for someone to have a loving role model in their lives. Not romantic, but just someone who supports them and cares for them, like genuinely cares for them. Most people find that in friends if you don't find it in your own nuclear family. But you have to have that, or else you're going to end up really, really damaged as a human. And to know that that's what Flint was to him, and all the kids, arguably, but mostly to him, I love seeing it, and just endears me to Flint even more.
Well, something I know, at least regarding Flint and Tanis, is that Tanis makes this comment about how Flint is older than everybody else. He is like him, where he can live older than a normal human lifespan. And so he has a little bit more ability to relate to Tanis in ways that the others can't, because he is older and he has been around longer, and he does have that more closely related tie of experiencing that longer lifetime. That sometimes he just can't get what he needs from the others because they haven't had that time to mature and to experience things.
Yeah, it's always interesting to me when you run across these sort of Dungeons and Dragons tropes of different races living for different amounts of time. But, like if an elf lives to 100, he's still considered a kid, for example. Like how in 100 years you could not grow up sensibly, like that doesn't make any logical sense to me, because you're still exposed to the world for 100 years. Clearly you're going to garner those lessons that a human experiences in the first 20 to be an adult. So that's always sort of been strange to me, like trying to sort of manage, well, what age is Tanis versus Laurana, and what is their emotional age at that point, and how old Flint is, and what his emotional age is, and their connection. I never even considered that they would connect over the fact that they both have this extended lifespan, as you're saying, and that would be an aspect to connect with, because of course it would be. Like I never even thought about that. But yeah, if you're the only two people in Solace that are living these extended lives, and you're seeing people come and go and live and die, yeah, you would it's like two vampires. Of course you're going to find a connection with each other.
Yep. So I really like that, especially because, and he even mentions he's his oldest friend as well, meaning like they've been the friends the longest, which also contributes to that as well.
Yeah.
I also think that Strum is a very connection to him, not quite as much necessarily as Flint, but also just because he accepts him and respects him so much. Like they are, I would say, like kind of like the best buddies of the group. Like as you said, like Flint's like his father figure, but like Strum's like his like best friend. And where Strum doesn't like the choices that he makes, especially when it comes to Rasslin and stuff like that. He is just like, why do you trust this guy? Why is he still here? But whenever Tanis makes that decision, or whenever he consults him, whatever, he does not argue. He doesn't put up a fight. He doesn't really cause a fuss. He's just like, okay, I trust you, and I know that you're going to make the right decision for us. And so I think that respect goes a long way for Tanis, especially as being a leader who doesn't want to be a leader. To have someone who doesn't like their decisions and yet respects them and follows them anyway is very empowering to a person, is very supportive for that person who has to take on all that responsibility and knows, okay, I don't know if I'm doing the right thing, but I have somebody who trusts that I will choose the right thing.
Yeah, I mean, Sturm is always going to be choosing the right path. It may not be the logical path or the path that leads to health and happiness and a future of life, but he lives this ideal that doesn't even really exist anymore. This ideal of the knight, the chivalrous paladin in the form of the Knight of Solamnia. And those people are shunned and outcast at this point, living in a remote isle of Shalsea. Everywhere else, they were like run out of their own home. Literally, Sturm himself and his mother. And so growing from this idealized way of life that is all but dead. I find it hard. On one hand, I find it hard to believe that he would still believe that after having grown up and had all the experiences he did and having no mentor to teach him about that knighthood. On the other hand, it gives you a character that is strong and confident in who and what they are, in the face of everyone else who's a little more malleable in their decisions and morals. Right. So it gives us the pure, hard, fast, this is what good is, and you need to balance that, or else it gets a little odd sometimes. And Tanis and him are great, two ends of a scale. And again, because they have that shared experience of growing up together, as much as a human grows up in Tanis's lifespan, they do trust each other. And so I do also love seeing that given an option, Sturm would probably take a different tact in almost every situation.
Pretty much, yeah.
But he always defers to Tanis because Tanis has never let them down, and he will always hold them up, always be there with them.
Yep, that's true.
That's great. I had written Raceland down, but they have less of a connection than I think any of the others that we mentioned. But I always did like the fact that he always went to Raceland for advice, his opinion on situations, sometimes separate from the rest of the group, just so he could get an honest, uninterrupted version of his opinion.
That's
because
true.
Raceland's so complex.
Out of everybody, Tanis respects him the most.
Which is weird.
I know. But I guess that does show, as we mentioned earlier, thanks to you, the neutrality of Tanis.
Right.
Is that he doesn't just see somebody as being maybe on the side of evil and just throwing them out and deciding that they're not worth it. He's totally that neutral balance of like, okay, I've got my friends that are clearly on the side of good, and I've got the friend that's maybe not. And obviously at the end, he truly makes that leap into the darkness. But he still respects that being quote, quote, good is not necessarily the only way of going about things. Yeah.
Another aspect of this that I always like to keep in mind is the shared history, because Raceland has always had a convoluted backstory. It's suffering from constant bullying and belittling, him being on the receiving side of all that, and always being physically weaker and stronger intellectually, but he's actually a genuinely caring person. Buppu is one of those characters where we get to see that come out. But even before that, if you read any of the, Margaret Weiss did a book called The Soul Forge and Brothers Magir and Brothers in Arms, where it gives you the history of Raceland in Solace with the companions growing up. And when the plague hit Solace, Raceland was there in the trenches helping people, helping them survive and overcome this illness. So, Raceland grows into being a very self-interested person, and arguably maybe that's partially because of what happens during his test and how Physnanalis takes, a piece of him, But I don't know. I think Tanis sees the version of Raceland that everyone else sees, but he also sees that person who is genuinely caring for those who are suffering and downtrodden, because he can identify. And I think that's part of it.
If we're going to look at, I think you're right. And I think that Tanis sees the part that even later, if you read Legends, where he does, you would think that he's evil because he's taking this path of wanting to become a god and replace Takhisis.
Yeah.
But at the end, when he realizes that will just kill the world, he abandons it immediately and lets himself be killed for that. So he is not so self-motivated that he is irredeemable or that he doesn't actually care about other people. you could even argue that, like, why else would he stay with the group for so long when clearly he hates everybody, or at least he treats them like he does.
Yeah.
But he does care about his friends. He does save them. He doesn't just abandon them. And I think that you're right. Tanis does see that portion of him, is that he does have this goodness in him, which is why I think he originally chooses neutral, is because, yes, he is a little self-interested and he does have a lot of hate and anger in the world for how he's treated, but at the same time, he's not purely bad, evil person.
Yeah. Very complex, for sure.
Yeah, I know. That's a whole nother discussion on him. But cool. I think that we actually covered quite a lot about Tanis today. I think we did really good.
Definitely.
Really broke him down really well. All right. Is there any last minute things that you want to add, or do you think we covered pretty much everything?
I think we pretty deeply covered his character. I mean, if you've never read the Chronicles and you don't really know Tanis that well, I would definitely encourage someone to do it, because he is a very, very relatable and interesting character, even though it's half elf in a fantasy universe. The motivations and the way he presents himself and the choices that he ends up making are all logical. We never talked about how, the end, him ending up with Laurana and what happens after that to his death. But as far as like a character setup, I think this did a really, really good job of that.
I agree 100%. And I think that he is one of the most memorable and relatable characters in the whole trilogy. Like he's the one that seems the most quote quote human, despite being a half human. So I definitely agree. And I mean, I would just recommend the books in general because they're excellent.
Yeah, for sure.
But I think anybody who reads it would love Tanis in particular. So. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thank you so much again for joining me today and doing this analysis.
Such a pleasure.
I had a really great time talking with you.
So did I. Thank you so much for having me on.
And all right, everybody, we'll go ahead and wrap up today's class, and I'll go ahead and see you in the next one.
Bye.
Bye.